In this unit, we're going to talk about drugs and alcohol. We're going to start off by talking about drunk driving. One of the things you see from this graph is that in general, rates of drunk driving in the United States have been steadily falling for a long time. As you can see, this graph shows the rate of total alcohol-impaired driving fatalities per 100,000, and they've dropped 63% since 1982. And so you see real progress has been made. One interesting thing about this, though, is we've noticed that all categories of crime have fallen, and drunk driving is no exception. One study shows that in fatal car crashes in 1982, about a third of the people involved were legally intoxicated, and that's down to about 19% today. So there's a lot less in terms of alcohol-impaired driving fatalities, and if that's the case, it's probably true that there are less drunk drivers on the road today, so drunk driving has fallen off. As you can see, risks of drunk driving depend a lot on how intoxicated you are. There isn't a linear risk between your blood alcohol level and your chances of being involved in an accident. It's an exponential risk that when you get beyond about 0.15, 0.16, the risk really goes up. So at the legal limit, risks are substantially higher than driving sober, but really the majority of fatal alcohol crashes occur with blood alcohol levels in the 0.15, 0.18, 0.19 range. So there's a linear increase. Now, the question is, why have rates of drunk driving fallen? Why have alcohol-related crashes become less common? Well, there's no doubt that activist groups, moral entrepreneurs, if you remember that term from earlier in the semester, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, have had an effect. They have made drunk driving a lot more deviant than it used to be. When I was a college-age person, it was nothing really for people to get in the car and drive home from the bar, and people would say, "Oh, are you okay to drive?" Yeah, I'm okay. And then we'd let people drive home. I mean, that happened. I saw that all the time. It was fairly common. And public awareness throughout the 90s and increased criminal penalties that these groups pushed for helped people realize that drunk driving is a horrible risk, not only for you as a drunk driver, but for the people that you might injure or kill. And so drunk driving changed from something that people laughed about to something that was deviant and was considered morally wrong. But before we let Mothers Against Drunk Driving take all the credit, let's keep in mind that there are other factors at play here too. For instance, we've seen that all categories of crime have fallen, and the curve for drunk driving looks exactly the same as other crimes. So it may be that this is just part of the natural crime decline that we've seen here in the United States. One thing that we noted earlier in the semester is that young people are more heavily involved in crime. Remember when we looked at UCR arrest rates, ages 15 to 24 were the crimogenic ages. And what you can see from these two graphs is that if you look at the orange bars or the reddish-orange bars here, what you see is when you look at the percentage of drivers involved in fatal crashes with blood alcohol levels over the legal limit, 21 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 34-year-olds account for better than half of all of those crashes. You can see that the rate goes down with age, just as other crimes go down with age. If you look at the blue bar chart down in the bottom right corner, you can see that when it comes to arrests for DUI, young people just past the legal drinking age, 21, 22, 23, these people have the highest rate of arrest for DUI. So one of the reasons why rates of drunk driving have gone down is that the United States as a society has gotten older and older. if it is the case that people under 25 are involved in most of these drunk driving episodes, just like they're involved in most crime, then to the extent that people in that age group are a smaller percentage of the population, then there will be fewer crimes of this type. So the rate for the drunk driving rate for people age 21 to 24 is 1,695 episodes per 100,000 people. And for senior citizens, it's only 78 per 100,000 people. Young people drive drunk at 21 times the rate of senior citizens. So the aging of licensed drivers is one of the reasons why rates of drunk driving have been declining, even net of the effect of activists like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In the past, Americans used more alcohol than they do now. Between 1850 and 1900, per capita alcohol consumption was about 2 gallons a year. Now that's just the alcohol. So if beer is 5 or 6% alcohol, that's just the alcohol part. So if you distill the alcohol down to its pure essence, per capita consumption was about 2 gallons per year for people 15 and over. From 1900 to 1920, this rose to about 2.5 gallons, and that's a lot more than we drink today. And then, interestingly enough, from 1920 to 1933, per capita consumption dropped to less than a gallon per person. Now, why the drop? Well, the reason is because the passage of the 18th Amendment criminalized alcohol, prohibition. I'm sure you've all heard of alcohol prohibition, and so we have an interesting experiment here on what criminalizing an intoxicant will do to rates of use of the intoxicant. And what you see is that criminalizing alcohol essentially cut its use in half. Now, that's a good thing, right? We've cut the use of alcohol in half, but interestingly enough, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibition, is the only amendment to the Constitution that has ever been repealed. Now, why was the 18th Amendment repealed if it was effective in lowering the use of alcohol? Well, one thing is it didn't eradicate alcohol. But the major problem is that once alcohol was criminalized, there was no legal way to procure alcohol. There was no legal way to produce alcohol. And so alcohol became the industry of notorious cartels and gangs. If you think about gangsters like Al Capone and the mafia in Chicago, their business was alcohol. And so what ended up happening is people started to see that the crime and violence associated with alcohol prohibition was worse than alcohol. And that's why prohibition was repealed. All the problems we had with drunkenness, the health problems associated with drunkenness, the social problems associated with drunkenness, these paled in comparison to the violence that was being perpetrated in the name of the business of alcohol when alcohol could only be distributed through the black market. And so this amendment to the Constitution was repealed and alcohol became legal again. So this is instructive for the way that we look at the link between other drugs and violence, because right now we have a system of prohibition where things like heroin and cocaine, and in most states marijuana, are illegal. And if there is a link between alcohol prohibition and violence, or alcohol use and violence, what is the link generally between intoxicants and violence? And there are three ways that scholars look at the link between intoxicants and violence. The first is what they call the psychopharmacological link. And the psychopharmacological link says that intoxicants cause violence because you take them and they change your brain chemistry, and you go crazy, and you commit crimes. And we see this with some drugs. Ironically, we see it with the drug that's legal. Don't you know anybody who is a nice, tranquil person, but then when they get drunk, they become mean and aggressive and obnoxious? That's pretty common. About half of all domestic assaults are committed under the influence of alcohol. There are other drugs that do this as well. You may remember the famous case of the person in South Florida who used these designer drugs, these bath salts, and ate the face off some guy. If you Google the face-eating Florida man, you'll hear all about it. There have been stories of people who have taken psychedelics and in their altered state have committed crimes, violent crimes. So there is some precedent, particularly with alcohol, for violent crimes and violence in general to be committed under the influence of these intoxicants. But there are other drugs for whom this link doesn't exist. So, for instance, there's no link between getting high on heroin and going crazy and committing crimes. When people use heroin, they just nod off, they become lethargic. And so the psychopharmacological link doesn't really work to explain the association between heroin and crime. People tend not to get high on marijuana and be violent. It tends to mellow you out. Drugs like ecstasy definitely don't promote violence among people who take them. So the psychopharmacological link has some merits, but it's not a completely satisfying explanation for the relationship between intoxicants and violence, because there are some drugs that don't cause violent behavior when you are intoxicated with them. The economic compulsive link between drugs and violence says that what happens is people take illegal drugs like heroin, like cocaine. They become addicted to these drugs. And because these drugs are very expensive and difficult to procure, what happens is the addiction drives them to commit crimes, say robberies, in order to procure money to buy the drugs. Now, that's an odd idea. What you're basically saying is that if someone could get heroin, they would just shoot their heroin and nod off and be high. But heroin withdrawal is so unpleasant that some addicts are willing to rob you at gunpoint or rob you with a knife in order to get money to stave off withdrawal. So it's not the drug that causes the crime, it's the absence of the drug that causes the crime. And there are certain advocates for drug legalization that say things like, if heroin was legal and addicts could get it cheaply, then they wouldn't commit these robberies. They would simply procure the drug. The cost of the drug is massively inflated. I mean, think about the loss of certain amount of product from seizures from law enforcement, the cost that goes into evading law enforcement. So the idea is that, heroin would be cheap otherwise, and so no one would rob you to get it. And advocates of this view, and there are many in the United States, but there are many more advocates of this view in Europe. For instance, Portugal has decriminalized all drugs, including heroin. The idea is that, it is bad to have junkies that are using drugs and that have no incentive to quit because they're being provided drugs, and that's not a good thing. But what advocates of this view say is that, bad as that is, it's better than having innocent people being robbed in order to procure these drugs. So they would say something like, you when you think about drug policy, you're not choosing between a great policy and a terrible policy. Drug policy is always terrible. You do not get to live in an America that's not screwed up by drugs, but you get to pick how it's screwed up by drugs. If you decriminalize these drugs, there isn't any doubt that people will continue to use them. Maybe more people will use them, and it'll be a lot of lost productivity at a minimum because of people using these drugs. And you get to decide whether that is worse than all of the robberies and the killings that are going on because of these drugs. So That's what these proponents would say. Now, there's not much of an appetite for the decriminalization of things like heroin and cocaine in the United States, but nevertheless, that is the idea behind the economic compulsive theory, that the cost of the drug is causing addicts to commit crimes, and that if they had access to these drugs, crime would be reduced. Closely related to the economic compulsive view is what we call the systemic view, the systemic link between drugs and violence. And this is the view that led to the repeal of alcohol prohibition. And the idea is that what causes the crime associated with these drugs is the black market that is associated with these drugs. So if I'm selling drugs on a particular street corner and you want that street corner, you have no way to deal with me legally. The only way that you can have the access to the lucrative market that I'm currently enjoying is to take me out, and the only way you can do that is with violence. If there's a dispute between drug dealers, you can't call the attorneys in and sit down and you can go to arbitration. If you are my supplier and you give me a certain amount of product to sell, and instead of selling it, I use it, there's no way you can call the police and tell them that I defrauded you, or there's no way you can go to civil court to try and recoup your costs. The only way that you can deal with me is to either just ignore the fact that I stole from you, in which case everybody on the street will know that you're an easy mark, or you have to deal with me violently. And so the idea here is that the crime that is associated with drugs is mainly due to the market for drugs, and that the violence is not a war over drugs, it's a war over money. That the violence at our border with respect to the smuggling of drugs is violence, not people taking the drugs and going crazy, but people wanting access to those few remaining ports of entry where drugs can be smuggled through, or those few remaining tunnels where they can get their product into the United States. And the idea is that if you legalized drugs, then you would wipe out these gangs and cartels. You would completely destroy their profit margins. They would have no incentive to sell these drugs because the price would be cheap, and these black markets would be obliterated. Now, in the United States, again, there is very little support for criminalizing hard drugs, but as we'll shortly see, there is one drug where the public has changed their minds drastically about legalization. As you can see, there is broad support for the legalization of marijuana. 2/3 of Americans essentially say that marijuana should be legal for recreational use. And you can see that number has risen steadily throughout the 21st century. And this is an issue where there is agreement, where a majority in both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, agree that marijuana should be legal, although for very different reasons. Democrats want marijuana to be legal because they've always been a little more libertine than their Republican counterparts, and they're not too concerned about intoxication with marijuana. Republicans that favor marijuana legalization have different ideas. Many Republicans have a libertarian streak, and they believe in small government. And when it comes to small government, drug enforcement is government. And so small government would be less drug enforcement. The idea is that there's something about personal responsibility, where people are responsible for their own actions. And if people want to be addicted to these drugs, that's stupid, but that's their business. And so many Republicans see drug enforcement as government overreach and a waste of time. And so that is why you see for the first time Republicans, particularly younger Republicans, joining Democrats to say, no, I don't think we should criminalize marijuana. Here you can see that age is a good predictor of whether or not you support marijuana legalization. For young people, the issue is completely settled. It's only your grandparents, people who were born between 1928 and 1945. These are the only people who remain majority opposed to the legalization of marijuana. And there are many things in American politics and American social policy that are generational. And every day when you wake up, there are fewer members of the silent generation. And every day when you wake up, there are more young people who are more predisposed to legalization of marijuana that become of voting age. And that's why if barring some sort of a shock to the system, if demography just runs its course, it wouldn't take long for marijuana to be legal in most states. Of course, there are a number of states that have legal marijuana. If you see this map of the country here, you'll see the red and green states are states that have some form of medical marijuana where people can use marijuana for specific medical diagnoses. But the striped states, Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, the District of Columbia, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, California, and Alaska. This is where states have legalized recreational marijuana use, where you can just walk into a store and buy marijuana. I was in Las Vegas last October, and there were stores on the Strip where you could, walk up to the counter and buy a joint. Now you couldn't smoke it in a hotel room; you can smoke it publicly. But if you in the comfort of your own home, you can buy a joint and you can smoke it, and it's completely legal. You can possess it and be carrying it, and it's completely legal. So the push for marijuana legalization has worked on the entire West Coast and is making inroads in New England. There are a number of states that seem to be very, very close to legalizing marijuana. It looks like they're on the precipice of legalizing marijuana in New Jersey. There was a vote there was a bill that was coming up in March, this past March, that just missed. And I'm sure they'll probably try again. And the longer you go, the more demography wends its way through the system. New Hampshire also, Michigan is on the cusp of legalizing marijuana. So there are any number of states that that will probably have ballot initiatives in 2020. And so with respect to marijuana, the push for legalization is well underway. And of course, one of the justifications for this is to get rid of that systemic link between drugs and violence. Here we see a article from the Washington Post showing that marijuana seizures at the border are down, that the price of marijuana is down, that attempts to smuggle marijuana are down, and that legal marijuana, according to the headline, is finally doing what the drug war couldn't, and that is destroying these cartels. Even if you think about the practice of marijuana smuggling, even if you wanted to sell marijuana in states where it's legal, who would be stupid enough to try and get marijuana through the border from Mexico if you could just drive your car to Colorado, buy a bunch of pot, put it in your trunk, and drive it back and sell it? So, marijuana, if you're going to be a pot dealer, the state of Colorado or the state of Massachusetts is a much better supplier than Mexico. And obviously this causes problems, and there are lots of problems in states that are adjacent to states with legal marijuana. Poor little old Utah, my home state, is sandwiched between Nevada and Colorado, and the price of pot there has plummeted because it's easy to just drive across the border. So there are lots of problems. But the idea is that legal marijuana has at least affected smuggling into the United States from other countries, particularly from Mexico. And here you can see a graph showing the percentage of the population that has access to legal marijuana, which now constitutes over 60% of the population, is because California is such a populous state. And then you see the orange bar, or the orange line, is marijuana in thousands of pounds seized by the Border Control. And you can see that the lines are crossed, and that the more marijuana is accessible to the population, the less is being smuggled in. And so people say, well, that's a good thing. But there are problems associated with this, and some of the opponents of marijuana legalization point out some of these problems. So let's go through those. One problem seems to be that marijuana use is very high in states where marijuana is legal. The dark purple are areas where pot is heavily used. And as you can see, in Northern California and parts of Washington, all along the West Coast, in Alaska, and in Maine, New England, there are pretty high rates of marijuana use, and that's where marijuana is legal. And so the idea is that if you legalize marijuana, then more people smoke it, which sounds reasonable. However, there are some people who argue that that's not necessarily the case. We don't know that for sure. For example, it could be that the legalization of pot prompts more people to smoke pot, but it could also be that in states where lots of people are already smoking pot, there's more support for legalization. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question. Which came first, legal pot or lots of pot smokers? There's not much appetite for criminal penalties for pot smoking when large percentages of the population are smoking pot. So we don't know for sure. Although it would stand to reason, just common sense, that legalization of marijuana would make it easier for some people who might have been deterred by the law to smoke it when they ordinarily wouldn't. Nevertheless, people compare the United States with the Netherlands, and they demonstrate that in the Netherlands, where marijuana has been legal forever, pot use is lower than it is in the United States. And the Dutch don't use pot that much. And the idea is that legalization of marijuana does something that reduces the use of marijuana. It makes marijuana boring. In our society, marijuana has this image of as a sort of countercultural thing. It's a little bit of a sign of rebellion. And so when you legalize it and sell it in a store, it takes away that symbolic value of marijuana. It makes it less interesting. At least that's so the theory goes. But people who are worried that the legalization of marijuana will lead to an explosion in marijuana use have to explain why marijuana use is so low in the Netherlands, where pot is legal. There are other people who acknowledge that, yeah, pot use might stay the same or might increase if marijuana is legalized, but what ends up happening is marijuana becomes the drug of choice and the only drug for people in states where marijuana is legal, and so people stop using harder drugs. And so you can see here are two graphs from a survey showing that among high school seniors, pot has held steady, but other illegal drugs besides marijuana for high schoolers have dropped. And so the idea is that if you acknowledge that a certain percentage of high school students, young people, are going to get intoxicated on something, then the best thing for them to be intoxicated on is marijuana, because it's less harmful than heroin or cocaine. And so the idea is that even if legalizing marijuana doesn't decrease or might slightly increase rates of use, that's okay, because it becomes a substitute for harder, more dangerous drugs, or so the logic goes. And you see that in states that have legalized marijuana, there is less alcohol consumption, that plenty of people are happy to switch marijuana for alcohol once marijuana is legal. And the idea is that if marijuana is better for you, well, it's not good for you, but I mean, if it's not as bad for you as alcohol, then that's on balance a net positive. That even if more people drink, if you're trading pot smokers for alcohol users, And that's a good trade, because alcohol is a more dangerous drug, more dangerous to society, and more dangerous for the individual user. Nevertheless, there are some genuine concerns with marijuana use. And one of these is that there are problems associated with marijuana and the developing brain. There are lots of studies that are demonstrating that marijuana has deleterious effects on teenagers who smoke, particularly teenagers that start early in their early teens and teenagers that use marijuana heavily. This is reporting on one study that shows that chronic early onset marijuana use is associated with lower IQ. And this is, I would say there are enough studies that demonstrate this, that I would say at this point it's conclusive. But this lower IQ is found only among chronic smokers, people who smoke a lot of pot, and those who start early. So I think what the research is demonstrating is that marijuana is very bad for the developing brain. And of course, human brains develop through their teens and into their 20s. And so it's probably not a great idea to get started smoking marijuana when you're 14. And it's probably not a great idea to smoke marijuana, every day or most days. That probably has bad effects on your brain. And so to the extent that marijuana, legal marijuana might be more accessible to youths, then that could be a bad thing. So studies like this are some of the things that people who oppose marijuana legalization point to. There's also pretty solid evidence that marijuana is associated with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness. It's a biological disease of the brain. And there isn't any doubt, I think there have been enough studies done that is quite conclusive that marijuana can trigger schizophrenia in people that are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia. Now, if you have a brain that's not genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, then, it's not going to trigger it. You have to have sort of the latent potential for schizophrenia in the brain. So if there's if there's schizophrenia that runs in your family, and it does run in families, then it'd be unwise for you to smoke marijuana. That's for sure, because once schizophrenia establishes itself, that's it. You've got it. And there is no cure. And what's scary about this, I think, is that although schizophrenia is fairly uncommon, it is something that has environmental triggers, and people can be genetically predisposed and not see it in their family. It could be a new mutation in your family, or it could be that people in your family have been genetically predisposed, but no one's ever developed the disease, and you wouldn't know it. Do you know whether or not you're biologically predisposed to schizophrenia? Probably not. And so there are a certain number of people who would likely develop schizophrenia, even if they knew about this link and said to themselves, well, it doesn't run in my family, so I'm safe. So this is another thing that I think the research has demonstrated that gives people pause about marijuana. For a long time, marijuana has been associated with something that psychologists have called amotivational syndrome, which is the idea that when people smoke pot, they just become lazy and they don't want to do anything, and they stay in their pajamas till 4:00 in the afternoon and never get anything done. But for the longest time, it has been unknown what the causal link is. In other words, we can't disentangle cause and effect. Is it that marijuana makes you lazy, or is it that lazy people really like marijuana? You can't really tell for sure until you start doing longitudinal studies. But now those studies are starting to come in, and the idea is, once again, that for heavy marijuana smokers, people who use almost daily or daily, and for people who got started young, there is some evidence to suggest that this affects dopamine levels in the brain and leads to this amotivational syndrome. So that marijuana can be the cause of this for some people. There's other evidence. There's lots of different things going on, but there's other evidence to suggest that marijuana use can lead to a low birth rate for pregnant women. Shouldn't smoke it if you're pregnant. And so all of these things are ideas that have been used to promote the continued prohibition of marijuana. But, legalization advocates say all those risks are there now. And, I think it's pretty clear that very few people that are inclined to smoke marijuana are deterred by the law. I mean, I don't know. I don't smoke marijuana. I don't, know anybody really who does. I mean, I don't know where to procure marijuana, but if I decided tomorrow that I wanted to start smoking pot, how long do you think it would take me to find somebody that would sell me pot? Or how long do you think it would take me to procure a bag of marijuana that I could start smoking? And what do you think the odds are that I would get actually arrested in the process of finding somebody that would supply me with pot? It would probably take me weeks, not months, and the odds of being arrested probably hover around 0. So the idea is that virtually everyone who is inclined to smoke marijuana is already doing it. And so what legalization does is takes away one of the worst things that can happen to you when you smoke marijuana, and that's branding you with a criminal record. That, when you talk to your kids about the dangers of pot, at the top of the list of these dangers are you could end up with a criminal record that could follow you around for the rest of your life. And the idea is that the harm from the substance should be worse than the harm that would come to you based on the law against the substance. If someone said to me, what's the worst thing that can happen to you on alcohol? I'd say, well, you get alcohol poisoning and die from an acute alcohol overdose. And cirrhosis of the liver is one of the most common lifestyle-related causes of death in the United States. I mean, there are all kinds of awful things that can happen with respect to alcohol, and we sell that in the grocery store. And so I think the marijuana legalization advocates say that all things being equal, and you can decide for yourself what you think. There are good arguments on both sides. But what marijuana legalization advocates say is that all things being equal, there is less harm from marijuana legalization than there is from continued marijuana prohibition, in much the same way that people believe there's less harm from the sale of alcohol legally than there was from alcohol prohibition. And of course, there are plenty of people who say, look, the war on drugs just simply hasn't worked. And some of the things that you're going to read will present this idea. The rationale for keeping things criminal are pretty common. And so I didn't, I don't know, what to include on readings that argue for the status quo. The status quo has plenty of support from the people and what you see on TV and what you hear. So I tended to include readings from people who want to upend the status quo. And I think their strongest argument is just by this graph. Here you see the bars represent the drug control budget, the DEA's budget, which has gone up and up and up and up. And then the tan line is the estimated purity of the drugs, and purity has gone up and up and up. And the green line is the cost of the drugs, and you see the cost has gone down. So we're spending more and more and more money on drug interdiction. Drugs are of higher and higher and higher quality, and they cost less and less. Now, what other evidence, legalization advocates would say, do you need that drug prohibition doesn't work? We may want it to work, but it doesn't work. And so why are we continuing to hit our head against the wall? Let's try something new that has a chance of working. That's what they would say. Now, you can decide for yourself what you think. And so the reading will introduce you to some of these ideas.